point I want to raise in relation to Richard Lockhead's question. He touched on the transition period, and I was just wondering, in terms of transition period, if that is agreed, would the UK government continue to contribute to the EU budget during that time? And also, would it be correct in saying then that if that transition period is agreed, that the UK would still be subject to all the rules and regulations of the EU, but would have no political representation or any influence in the decision making during that time?
I'd caveat with the response with, obviously that hasn't been, the transition period hasn't been agreed, but the intention, as David Davis has set out when he appeared before the DEXU committee in the House of Commons, was that as much as possible would stay the same, because what the feedback from business and other stakeholders is that they want really just one point of change. They don't want to have to go through a change at in March 2019 when we entered the transition period, and another change as we left the transition period. So the intention or wish that we would want in relation to the transition period is that everything would be as much as is possible equivalent to the arrangements that exist. Now, of course, there are some complexities. Mr. Lockhead alluded to one in relation to the common fisheries policy, the common agricultural policy, when you're effectively have left the EU, and those issues will have to be resolved. The Prime Minister has made, the government has made a clear statement in relation to the funding position, which would continue in that period as part of the overall arrangements for, as we would see it, meeting all our obligations as we leave.
Those important decisions that you touched on there, like agriculture and fisheries, we would have no political representation and say on how those decisions are made.
Well, we will not be a member state of the EU, and that is the consequence of the outcome of the referendum, and that is a fact. But of course, that would be the same position if we were in EFTA or EEA arrangements. That's the basis on which they proceed.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I really want to touch on, focus on EU citizens though. In your opening statement, you said that the UK is in touching distance of a deal with the EU on citizens' rights. However, would it not be fair to say that there are still substantial hurdles to be overcome in that, in relation to the rights of extended family and in terms of the role of the European Court of Justice in upholding citizens' rights? And how do you see those hurdles being overcome?
I think that the level of agreement that we've managed to reach gives us a hope that the outstanding issues can be resolved. I think we have come a very significant distance. We want to make sure that EU citizens can remain in the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister has always set out the value, importance, the welcome that she has in respect of EU citizens. So we want to be able to conclude those arrangements. Of course, as we've set out previously, we want to be able to ensure that UK citizens who are resident in other parts of the EU also have equivalent rights. But I am confident that in that area we are going to be able to get a resolution.
I think it's all very well that the Prime Minister welcomes EU citizens and has offered those platitudes, but essentially I feel like that's all that they are, because it isn't very reassuring to the EU citizens living in this country when they really don't know what's going on. And in terms of a no-deal scenario. Now, I understand this may be something you don't want to see happen, but in the committee, the Scottish Affairs Committee last week, you said that we understand the need to prepare for a no-deal scenario. That is the responsible thing to do. What does a no-deal scenario look like for the EU citizens living in this country and indeed for the UK citizens living in the EU?
A no-deal scenario is in my view, where we effectively leave the EU on WTO terms, but that various other agreements have been put in place. So although that is characterised as no deal, it is effectively a minimalist deal. And I would anticipate that even if we left on the basis of a minimalist deal, we would fully implement the arrangements that have already been negotiated and are close to being finalised in relation to EU citizens. We want EU citizens to be able to remain in the United Kingdom. We want UK citizens to be able to remain in the EU.
There are just a couple of other points that I feel are really important and need to be discussed. In terms of settled status, now, we were told in evidence to this committee that there's a legal uncertainty around that term, and it's particularly problematic because of the uncertainty that it gives for landlords, employers, and indeed the NHS in terms of how they will treat people. So are you able to tell us exactly what settled status will mean, and how will that compare to the current rights that EU citizens have living in this country?
What I'll do, because of because these are complex issues, I will write specifically to the committee on the settled status issue. But basically, anyone who has been in the UK for 5 years at a date which will be the subject of negotiation will be able to achieve settled status. If they haven't achieved the 5 years, they will be able to remain for the remaining part of the 5-year period to reach that point. But I do recognise, the complexity of the issue and the points you raise, and I'll write to the committee, in greater detail on that.
Thank you. I do appreciate that, but to be honest, it's all very well writing to the committee, but we're not the ones who need to be informed about what's happening, because I think that it's the uncertainty for the people, the EU citizens living here, that they really need to know what's going on. And that would lead me on to communication as well. What is the communication strategy in terms of informing EU citizens of the most up-to-date information that's happening with EU negotiations and about what their future status might be? We took evidence from EU citizens to this committee. They told us that they're dependent on newspaper reports, having to check things online with nothing in terms of direct communication. So how is that going to be handled from here on in?
There is a very specific online opportunity to get the maximum possible information, and I will share that with the committee. I accept that needs to be widely promulgated. I understand the concerns that people have had during this. It is an uncertain period, and I absolutely understand that. But that's why we want to resolve it as quickly as possible to bring as much certainty as was possible. I would have preferred that we had actually, been able to negotiate this immediately, that Article 50 was triggered, but the EU didn't want to proceed on that basis at that time. But you're absolutely right. It's incumbent on us to get as much information to people as we possibly can. I think there is always and there are always different opportunities and ways to doing that. But the website, which I'll provide details of, is very, very comprehensive.
To be honest, though, I don't really think that's acceptable in terms of that's something that people have to actively go out and try to find rather than direct communication. And just one final point that I think is vitally important to raise is in terms of discrimination. We heard direct evidence here that people are actively being discriminated against in terms of applying for jobs, in terms of applying for mortgages and getting and applying for homes. And as well as that, we heard there were reports in the press last week about the increase in exploitation by unscrupulous employers who are taking advantage of the uncertainty over Brexit and what that's doing in terms of trafficking and slavery. So in terms of all those issues, what work is being undertaken by the UK government? How aware are you of the problems there, and specifically what actions are being taken to tackle that?
We are aware that, and the evidence that you took was an important important validation of that these issues are underway are taking place. I mean, obviously we do have, both within Scotland and the UK, comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation, and that that in itself should be utilised where these cases come to the fore. We've got very comprehensive, both here in Scotland and UK anti-slavery and a real determination, I think, in relation with both governments, not to tolerate in any way modern slavery or trafficking, and we must utilise those laws and means, and anybody who's got any information about that happening needs to get that to the police. It's not acceptable, but we need to we do also need to in relation to the discrimination that you mentioned in relation to financial arrangements and mortgages in housing. We take that very seriously and are looking at what additional measures could be taken in addition to the comprehensive arrangements that are in place.
Something proactively being done at the moment, because I understand what you say about the legislation being there to tackle that, but it's all very well looking at it now, but it's been ongoing for a while, it's continuing to happen, and I think that people need to be reassured that the government is proactively looking at ways to tackle this, and it's those proactive actions that would be looking there's a lot of proactive action going ahead in relation to the modern slavery and trafficking front, for example, on that specific. But I'm making it very clear, as I possibly can, that that's the sort of discrimination that you mentioned in your rant is just not. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable here in Scotland. It's not acceptable anywhere in the UK. If we have comprehensive discrimination laws within both Scotland and the UK, but if they're not adequate, then something further would need to be done. Thank you.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you. Secretary of State, will the final deal, whatever form that takes, be subject to